Should we get started?
Yeah, we can do that. Close this here.
Okay, is it me?
Yeah. Do you want to open up?
Let's do it. All right, let's start prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you that we can come together and just learn a bit about you, Lord. Please help this conversation be fruitful and understanding, and just get into the weeds a little bit here. So just pray that Kal will be able to try to communicate a little bit of things that we're trying to communicate in a way that's understandable. Just in pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to continue down the same theme that we've been doing for, I think, 3 weeks now.
Yeah, this is the third week.
Sweet. So we're going to be talking about the historicity of the New Testament, kind of going along that theme, definitely getting into more of some of the practical areas, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah. Here's a quick roadmap of where we're going. I decided to end the year actually talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the historical claims around that, different arguments either way, and we'll get into like Habermas's minimal facts approach and all that sort of stuff. So, and then starting the new year, we'll get into like, when were the Gospels actually written, what about the rest of the New Testament, etc. Sources. They're all the same as before, yeah.
All right, so quickly what we went over last week, we went over the logical fallacies, which was important to not us to fall into them and also recognize them that are being used against us. You guys are all very familiar with that, I'm sure. Talked about cognitive biases, which is also fallacious in a way, but it's subconscious, right? So we don't really know we have them, so it's important to put yourself under scrutiny and see that other people have them. And then we talked a lot about the philosophical assumptions of naturalism and miracles.
Yeah. So this week we're going to talk about the key claims behind both, but the key point that I want to take away really is that the New Testament writers made factual, falsifiable claims about events that they actually experienced. So there's a lot built in there that I guess, to use a Pastor Johnism, that we'll unpack. To go along with this, though, is a idea that many people I've seen brought up, which is that the Bible actually encourages people to have a blind faith, that encourages them to not actually investigate the claims, but just to take them at face value. And one thing that they could maybe say about this is like Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. How often has something like that been brought up? I've actually heard he doesn't call himself an atheist anymore, but a famous YouTuber called Alex O'Connor brings up the experience of the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas and seeing the resurrected Jesus, and saying, isn't that a story where Thomas said, unless I put my fingers in your hands, sort of thing, and then he sees Jesus and he doesn't even need to do that, and Jesus then says this very famous line of, because you have seen, you have believed, blessed are those who believe even though they have not seen.
Yeah.
And the reality is, though, that the Bible doesn't encourage simply a blind faith. Rather, it encourages us to be certain, even though we cannot necessarily see what Thomas was seeing, right? It's a very key distinction. Just because we don't have the ability to see Jesus physically resurrected does not mean that we should not go through with it. And in fact, Jesus makes this thing over and over and over again. So, for example, he says right here, as I believe the Pharisees, if I'm not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, like the words he's saying, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So once again, this is a claim where Jesus is saying, hey, I'm giving you evidence here to prove that I am who I say that I am. It's very, very important. So even though we cannot necessarily see Jesus, we can, however, believe and be certain of what we do not physically see, but what we see through history and logic and reason. Once again, John actually explains the reason for his gospel here, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So this actually happens immediately after John records the event of doubting Thomas, seeing Jesus, and then believing. And so he says, hey, many, many more things have happened, but these specifically are written. The whole book, basically, is written as testimony to the real evidence of why you should believe in Jesus Christ. It's not just, hey, believe me because I'm right, or whatever. It's not just, believe me because we're really good friends. It's, no, believe me because of the actual truth that has occurred in this testimony.
I think that's a great point. I just read a book called Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard, he's a Swedish philosopher, and the entire book, the premise of the book is to examine the story of Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham. And the point is to put faith as a higher virtue than reason, right? Because it's coming right from like that Sartre Enlightenment, philosophy at the time. And his point was that it's not a blind faith, right? There's reasons to have the faith, but the action of the faith itself is higher than reason. And he explains that by saying, think about Isaac, the torment, first of all. He's all about existentialism, right? So the torment he must have had as Abraham took Isaac up to the mountains for 3 days and didn't tell him he's going to kill his own son, right? And then to actually take that knife and bring it down and then to kill his son. And he said, all that he could do himself, Kierkegaard could do. And I think most of us could probably do that. Because the real faith was when Abraham actually believed that he would sacrifice Isaac, and somehow God would either bring him back or still fulfill his promise in the end. Right? So it's that action of faith is a very high virtue, and that's what's reckoned to Abraham. And that's, I think, more the faith of what Hebrews is talking about, which doesn't discard the reasons to have the faith. You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of the distinction.
Exactly. I see it similarly to the idea of purpose applied to reason, right? Reason without purpose is meaningless. It is chaos. Faith brings purpose into our reason.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it too.
Yeah,
a lot of different ways to come at it.
A lot of different ways to come at it, right? But the point is, if you have faith in something but you can't apply reason to it, then it almost seems a little bit like James is saying, if you have faith but you can't apply works to it, well then what is the faith even real? But once again, that doesn't make it the other way around, right? Faith definitely proceeds. So, and once again, Paul makes this very clear. He's like, hey, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sin. So he's saying one of the key claims is that, Jesus has been raised from the dead. And he's saying this has to be true. If it is not true, then all of this is pointless. So that leads us into, where we are today in terms of what claims can we investigate, and if we can find out that they're factually true, or if we can find out that they're factually false, then it kind of sums up Christianity itself, right? Right? If we find out that the claim of Jesus being raised from the dead is factually false, then it would lead to
discount the entire religion.
Exactly. So we'll get a little bit into kinds of different claims, and so this is one of those things. We really have kind of like in a courtroom where we have the prosecution and the defense. They each make their own claims, but they have specific claims that apply to particular details, and they have grand claims that apply to the entire picture, right? So these grand claims kind of end up being more like conclusions, more like the logical conclusion of those specific claims. So generally, you can't examine grand claims directly. You can't see how they're factually attached. You instead have to make up a little chain of sorts up to your grand claims from those specific claims. So, for example, if one of my grand claims is that I'm rich, then a specific claim to back that up might be that I have $1 million in the bank. I can't simply prove that I'm rich on its own. It doesn't hold up anything. You need additional evidence for it. So it's a concept that's greater than all of these smaller things. And of course, there's other aspects to it, right? Like the claim that I'm rich potentially has some sort of moral claim aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
It has a definitive claim to it as well. So
you really have to unpack it to understand what they're saying.
You have to unpack it more. Exactly. That's the specific point. So in our courtroom example, the grand claims of the prosecution is that the suspect is guilty, while specific claims might come down to like DNA evidence or witness testimony. Mm-hmm. And then likewise, the defense also has a grand claim that the suspect is not guilty, and then various specific claims which support their conclusion. The point is, we have to examine not only just the grand claims to see if they're reasonable, but also the specific claims to see if they hold up those grand claims, right? And so today we're going to go over specific stuff. So I had a bit of an idea. So these are both images of Lake Powell. But one is more of an overview. It gives you a much bigger picture that you can potentially draw greater power from, I guess you'd say. But it needs to be built up by more specific things in the minutia. So, yeah. So we'll get into some of the grand New Testament claims. The New Testament actually makes a ton of grand claims, and I didn't put these together like super formally. Among these, Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, salvation from sin and death, God came as a man, Christianity is based on truth, etc. A lot of these are actually not able to really be historically tested, right? Like the idea of salvation from sin and death. Mm-hmm. That isn't something that we can go and look at, but we can see how from these specific claims, for example, that Jesus is God and, he died and then rose from the dead, how that can build up into it. So, let's see. They're really grand claims. They explain pretty much everything connected to everyday life, meaning and purpose, morality, why bad things happen, the relationship between God and mankind, where goodness comes from, etc. Lots and lots and lots of things. But once again, it's difficult to prove any of these on their own.
It makes me think of the apologetic aspect of this. Like if you're trying to connect somebody to the reality of the claims that the New Testament is making.
Yes.
And you cannot, sometimes it's hard to really even establish whether or not the person you're talking to is even persuadable.
That's true.
You might have a stone wall that
yes.
they built out and you're just not going to get over it. But it's the whole whether it's possible or not, I think is
that is a really big one, and we talked about that in our philosophical assumptions a little bit. The assumption of naturalism almost by definition precludes precludes miracles, right? It says miracles can't happen, and so you end up with this disconnect immediately, where you need to get over that philosophical assumption first before you can even honestly approach many of these claims.
That's a great point. Actually, sometimes I get in a fight with like ChatGPT. I'll just argue with them, and I got him to totally change his mind on one perspective. I think it gave me like a blanket answer, and then when I broke it down, it switched it.
Yeah, I think you can. It's like made to be so agreeable that
exactly. If you
hammer on something enough, it'll be like, well, if you say so.
Yeah. So, but I was doing that with it on the claim of naturalism, because it's saying that that's just as like faith, or it's just as good of a claim as supernaturalism. But I think when you're talking about faith, like they're saying that you just take the blind faith of the Bible. There's really no blind faith there. The only blind faith is actually the naturalistic assumption, because there is no reason to take that assumption for its whole.
Yeah, if reality is simply a series of events, then we can only go based on the events we have observed. And a supernatural event, we just might not have observed one yet.
100%.
Right? Yeah. So from a pure philosophical perspective, I think I would agree that naturalism actually assumes more than supernaturalism.
Yeah, it's not as open. It's not as fair, I would say.
Yeah.
It's not as fair.
Yep. It is very important to be able to connect your grand claims to specific claims. If people are, if the prosecution is trying to, claim, hey, person A murdered person B, and they have like a murder weapon, and they're like, hey, this murder weapon is what killed person B, but they can't connect person A to the murder weapon, then their grand claims fall apart, right? Because their specific claims aren't able to connect to their grand claims. And so that is a very important process as well. And so in the New Testament specifically, as far as the connecting to some of the grandest themes, really is miracles. It really is comes down to Jesus's death and his resurrection.
And that's even what Jesus was saying is like, if you want to believe my works, like the evidence for that work is miracles. He kind of just comes out and says it.
Yeah. So here's a big list of specific claims that the New Testament makes. This picture, by the way, is a picture of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's in Jerusalem, and this is where they believe Jesus' tomb was. This literal physical place. Oh. It's really cool. There's a whole history. So it turns out that the Christians thought this was really important, and so they built a little memorial, and then the Romans came and destroyed everything, and then the Romans thought, hey, that's bad because Christians are coming here to do stuff, so we'll put a memorial on top of it, we'll put a pagan temple on top of it, and that'll quash all their hopes and dreams. And so it turns out that there's just been temple upon temple upon temple here over time, and you dig down and you find that that obviously the tomb itself was destroyed because that's what Rome wanted, but they built a little church there. So I thought that was pretty cool. So miracles, Jesus' resurrection, feeding the 5,000. We could possibly examine these claims to see if they hold up with and are consistent with the rest of the New Testament. Makes claims about architecture. So there's the pool called Bethesda that John describes as having 5 porticos. In John 5, chapter 5, verse 2. Now there's in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So pretty interesting. The pool at, is that called Shiloh? I guess. So in John 9, chapter 9, verse 7, and he said to him, go wash in the pool of Shiloh, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. And so both of these places are a reference to a real physical place. Perhaps we can find them, and maybe that would corroborate something that John says. If we can't, then maybe that casts some doubt on the validity of his testimony. Towns and cities are another thing. There are many, many different towns, cities, villages that are all referenced by the New Testament authors with different cultures, etc. So if we can determine whether these places actually existed, it might help us validate the claims of the New Testament. There are also names, many, many different names that are used in the New Testament for people of different backgrounds, cultures, and statuses. And this to me is actually really interesting. Name frequency is a thing that they use a lot because it actually helps, it really helps distinguish forgeries from the real deal. Because when people are buried, when they die, they have a very common practice, I don't know if you've been to a cemetery, of putting names on of the people who died. And if we find ancient tombs, we find ancient names. And so if you find a manuscript and it has names that match up with those tombs, with those ancient names that we know were there of people who actually died, because no one writes stuff on stone unless it's really important. And then we can conclude, hey, maybe these are from the same era, maybe they're talking about the same thing. But if this document claims to be from somewhere where it doesn't match up with the names, then that casts a lot of doubt on it. And so we can look at the name frequency, we can determine, maybe whether the people that were referenced actually existed as well. So famous people are good examples of this. And so as an example for name frequency, like the name Simon was a very common name in the Gospels. And so if it was actually a common name in Israel at the time, we would expect to find it with a similar frequency to which it's referenced in the Gospels. And one thing that's even more important is you can see attribution as well. So what the Gospels will do oftentimes is they'll say, like, well, he was Simon called Peter, or this was Simon the Zealot. And so they'll add an additional identifier there to help us determine which Simon they're talking about, because there's multiple of them. And you would expect that to be more common with names that are more frequent. When you in the Gospels actually hold up to that quite well as well. And so we'll get into more of the specific how things hold up and or if they don't later. But these are just some of the categories of things that we can go through and look at.
This is interesting. They're all good points you don't really think about. They're not intuitive. But
Yeah, they're not intuitive,
oh, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and I put Lazarus, Mary, and Martha because while even relatively unknown people can still help us potentially identify whether the New Testament writers were talking about real people or just making stuff up. And so Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are an example of this, where we can find a tomb or some other writing, where if we can find a tomb or some other writing referencing their names, then that also adds some credibility. Mm-hmm. And then customs and cultures change a lot over time. And so if we know something specific about, say, Roman culture, and the Bible references that, and those happen to line up, then that, again, adds credibility. So, for example, the practice of crucifixion was described in detail, actually quite a bit of detail in the Gospels. And if they got it wrong, if there was a particular thing that the Gospels said that just we knew didn't happen in the Roman Empire at that time, then that would be another way to potentially falsify.
So I think that's a great point. A quick side note on that. I think we often think about in today's world, I mean, you guys all looked into this, I'm sure, on your own a little bit, so you guys probably don't fall into this as much. But people in general think that the information that we have was accessible to everyone, which is just not true at all.
Yeah.
But when I was doing my research for this class, I kept running into the problem, oh man, what's his name? I want to make sure I get it right. The Jewish historian that's super famous.
Oh, Josephus?
Josephus. So he'll have writings that will be explicitly saying Christ is Lord, he's the Son of God, and it's why is this Jewish historian doing this?
Yeah.
And it's because the Christians would get a hold of this and just rewrite it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's you could do that back then. You could just rewrite history, and it's in order to get it to fit a better narrative. So if we start to see these customs that we know from now, with very much a high level of scrutiny, looking at old texts that are discovered, even just 10, 20 years ago, that line up with those customs, it's actually a really strong piece of evidence.
Yeah, exactly. And as far as other things as well, towns, cities, architecture, whatever else, you really could have only known that if you were there at the time.
Right.
It's not you could be in some place in Turkey and be like, oh, you know what? I bet this pool called Bethesda had 5 colonies.
Yeah.
There's
no internet. You can't just Google that.
Yeah, exactly.
There's wiping those out.
Yeah, and the availability of the maps. If you've ever seen when they were discovering North America and maps, and then compared to now, you're like, wow, they were really horrible at making maps.
Yeah.
And it's the same sort of thing back in the day. You couldn't just look at a map and be like, you know what? I bet from this map that place is actually a little bit higher than this place. There we go, right? And so when you see stuff like that, and it actually lines up with reality, it lends credibility to, at the very least, the idea that these were written by someone who's very familiar with the area, with the geography at the time, with the names and the people of the times as well.
Yeah, I don't understand how it could be controversial.
Yeah.
Personally,
for example, as far as name frequency, we have manuscripts of I believe what they call the Gospel of Barnabas. Mm-hmm. And if you look at name frequency, it matches up with what you would expect from ancient Egypt, not Israel. Mm-hmm. Even though it's claiming to be about Israel. And so just based on that fact, that adds quite a bit of doubt to the validity of the Gospel of Barnabas, particularly if it's self-aware, right? John's Gospel is self-aware. He's saying, I'm a real person writing this to you so that you can, about real events, so that you can believe. It's not just trying to convey some sort of spiritual truth or whatever, and the details don't matter. He's saying explicitly that the details matter.
Yeah, it's a historical narrative versus wisdom literature.
Yeah, exactly.
Quick question? What's your sense of where the debate is on these claims? Are these all hotly debated these
No.
days? Or
No. So we actually have a trend now, which is really interesting to me, particularly because of archaeology. We have a trend where skeptics from the 1800s, 1900s were saying, I'm going to pick out this particular detail about something, a physical claim, and I'm going to say, that seems quite unlikely. Mm-hmm. And then we find something like a tomb or a headstone or a memorial or like a whole actual pool with a building around it that actually validates the claims that the Gospels make. So we actually have a trend of where people pick out certain things and then they'll say, well, based on my experience, I think this is unlikely and a reason to doubt, this Gospel or that Gospel. And then we literally find something in the real world that validates the Gospel.
Yeah. So along those lines, I actually was just researching that kind of same question related to the crucifixion, because that seems the one that people talk about a lot. And the only thing that I can see, there's a lot of pushback from the Muslim community, right? Because they believe that Christ wasn't actually crucified because it's written in the Quran. But other than that, it was ChatGPT. It was saying pretty much all the scholars believe everywhere that Christ was crucified and that it was a real event. It's written by
exactly. And it really goes along with a quote that I had last week from Cold Case Christianity, where he says that skeptics, if the Gospels didn't contain miracles, he doesn't see a reason why, any valid reason why any reputable historian at all would ever cast doubt on their validity. He thinks that they would just accept it wholesale if it weren't for the miracles.
Gets right back to the main point, those miracles.
Exactly.
One of the best set of historical documents of any kind from anywhere, right?
I think you still have to say that, even with the miracles in there. Just from an objective standpoint, it's been the most studied book ever.
Well, it's actually really interesting. So there's this other guy. I was literally watching him last night. He's I guess you could call him a historian, but he studies ancient documents, particularly the manuscripts. And it's really interesting because he pointed out a thing where the Gospels actually get certain things right, where other very, very well-respected historians like Tacitus get it wrong.
Really?
Yeah, so for example, Pontius Pilate. Tacitus called him a procurator, when in reality he was a governor, and Luke gets the title right. Luke says, no, this was Governor Pontius Pilate, and instead Tacitus got it wrong and called him a procurator. And the reason why we know this is because we found in the real world a memorial saying this is dedicated from Governor Pontius Pilate for whatever of a reason.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's crazy how those all those details line up, and so you can go, well, man, I mean, everyone just seems like we should take Tacitus' word above all else. But then we know that Tacitus was wrong about something. I guess no one's perfect, but
yeah, of course, yeah.
Except we haven't been able to poke those sort of holes in the Gospels unless you take a naturalistic perspective.
Right. Yeah, that's a key point. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the grand skeptic claims. So the grand claims from the skeptic perspective quickly here. We just have a few minutes, but the good thing is, I think did you guys all go into Pastor Gold's class a little bit when he talked about this kind of stuff? Or not? Maybe not? Okay.
Years ago.
Maybe I'll hit it a little bit harder then, because he talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
I'm taking most of this just from a source perspective from Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. So that's my source here. But basically the large claims, that Kal put these out, and I think they're really good claims, is that miracles are impossible, God doesn't exist, and Christianity is not based on truth. So some of the specific claims that I think lead up to those grand claims, for the miracles are impossible, it really just seems to be that God doesn't exist. That seems to be the main claim, and I think that you can support that argument with some of the major arguments for the existence of a God, a singular God, right? You got the cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument. The first point is that all these are falsifiable claims. You can kind of prove these wrong, which is a good thing. So it means it is a sound argument. To go through them just quickly, cosmological argument is the idea that everything has a beginning, right? So when you go back through all of nature, you have to have what's called a first cause. And then that first cause has to be outside of the laws of nature. So it doesn't actually claim a personal God at all. That's something that I think Christians and Muslims get confused sometimes. So like, it's God, but it's like, well, it's a being that chose to create something at a specific time, which shows will, but it's not personal, right? We can't claim personality. All we can claim is that there probably is a all-powerful being.
Yeah.
Right. So important caveat, because the skeptics will come at us when we make that claim and be like, well, that doesn't prove God, but it's like, you're right, it doesn't prove God.
Yeah,
It proves an all-powerful being.
and it's another tricky semantic sort of thing, because a lot of atheists are fine with the idea of God as long as that God's not personal.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to get to that note on the deist too, because a lot of atheists kind of fall into this deist category because they want to take really the moral argument for God's existence, right? So I think we've beaten this to death in this class, that you can't really get to morals at all without there being a God. So in the 1700s, really just the 1700s, there was this really popular movement, a philosophical movement called deism. So they would basically accept that God existed, that he made creation, but once he created it, he stepped away. And he just allowed creation to do its thing. So like Thomas Paine, I believe, Thomas Locke, John Locke.
Yeah, John Locke.
John Locke, Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, yeah.
So they all kind of took this idea, but
Yeah, Jefferson was really weird. He had like his own version of the Bible where he like clipped out things.
Yeah.
That he didn't like.
Customized.
Customized, yeah.
You can buy that at Monticello, by the way.
Really?
You can buy this Bible.
That's kind of
That's
so
sweet.
wild.
That's like super radical.
Didn't know the power of the president reached that far.
I heard that it's possible, this is a total side tangent, or it is possible he might have clipped that out to share those with the
to share those with
like
people.
natives.
Gotcha.
But that seems a little
That
bit
seems a
like
little
Christian
far-fetched,
nationalism for me.
yeah.
Like, Thomas Jefferson was great, but I don't know. So yeah, the deists, they got popular for a while, that wanted to have their cake and eat it too. But there were serious problems with that, and that's why it's just died out. It's just not really a popular movement.
Yeah, you
anymore.
can't really believe in the Christian God and not believe he's personal. If he
Right.
literally came down to earth.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
As
cross,
Jesus.
it's like,
And-
I believe that, but he didn't do that because he liked us.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, like, if there is a God that created the universe, wouldn't he want himself to be known? You know what I mean? Like, why else would he create the universe? So there's a lot of arguments there.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say that's probably becoming more and more common over time, I think, in the atheist circle, is rather than an explicit claim that God does not exist, they will simply say, well, we can't know if God exists, or I don't know whether God exists or not. It's more of an agnostic claim, but they still ultimately fall under the atheist category just because of the where they understand they get their morality from, etc. Right? They might still make positive claims that you don't need God for morality, for example, while still being like, well, actually, I don't know about God.
Yeah, Nietzsche writes in Genealogy of Morals that, like, that's the weakest position possible. It's just to say, I don't know. He's like, be a man and pick a side, because he was an atheist. He picked a side, but he's like, at least I'll own it. Like, you guys are the worst. So kind of interesting. But we're kind of running out of time, so we can go to the next one quickly. These are some of the specific claims: is that Jesus didn't die, that he wasn't raised from the dead, and that the New Testament presents a mythological version of Jesus.
Yeah. And all of these are attacking the factual claims of the Gospels and the New Testament. And it's something that has been, in the 80s and, in the 1800s and 1900s, got super big, and it's been dying down, I'd say, slowly.
Okay.
It's still made a lot, but more often you'll see things like the problem of evil argument or more philosophical arguments compared to factual arguments against the Gospels.
I think the only note that I want to hit here, I'm sure you might want to get into this later on in your class, but the problem with John, like, a lot of people attack John because it's not a synoptic gospel and all that. I think it's easier to just not argue from John in general, because all the claims I think you can get from John, I think you can get them also from the synoptic gospels.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's kind of my thing. It's like, I think there's so much claim.
And that is a very effective mechanism for Muslims, actually. Muslims aren't atheists, but to just say, well, let's put John aside for now and go with Mark, the one that you say is the best.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I don't know. Like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't have a problem with that. I think that Mark does have claims of Christ's deity in it as well.
Exactly. So, and that is a good argument to bring up with Muslims. And but yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, when we're talking about are the Gospels reliable, that does include
It does
John.
include John. Yeah.
And so you do need to evaluate it, and it turns out John, once again, is very, very accurate.
Right. Right. Which is why we put it as canon.
Yeah. So I kind of had a little bit of a funny idea, which is, well, what's his name? Mr. Wallace presents in his book this idea of, can we convict the New Testament authors of writing their books? Can we say, like, yeah, we know this, and we know this, and we know this, and you were here in this place, and you were the only person who really could have had this knowledge, and this knowledge, and this knowledge. So from all this evidence, we're going to convict John the Apostle of having actually written John's Gospel. And it's a similar sort of idea. Or can we convict myth and legend of actually being the reason why we have these Gospels? So it is, once again, in the courtroom idea of taking a step back and going, okay, so apart from the specific claims in each of these things, can we attach those claims to the specific people? You know, do we know in the environment that these things came from, are they true? Or, you know, is it not just the factual claims are true, but it's even more true because the meta narrative around that is also true. So I thought that was interesting. And then once again, we have evidence to back it up. You know, the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. This is it's not like a mural, but it's a carving in the Arch of Titus that's in Rome. So after Titus said, hey, those Jews, we hate them, level Jerusalem, and they come back and there's the menorah, I believe, is that even the ark?
There you go.
The point is, there's this mural of them carrying it off from the temple as a witness to the destruction of the temple that we have in Rome right now. So we know the temple got sacked and Jerusalem got destroyed just purely from that, and that's just one piece of evidence as to that particular event. Other things, we have early manuscripts, right? Like Papyrus 46, the early manuscript of Romans. And then, potentially, evidence number 3 is that the gospel writers themselves never identify themselves. It's always identified later in tradition. And so, maybe that casts doubt on some of the credibility of their witness statements. So, cool. All stuff that we'll get to in the following weeks.
All right. So thanks for coming, everyone. I think I do want to just bring up briefly, I think you guys actually all know this, but I'm actually leaving Frontline. My in Julia R. It's over it is a theological reason why we're leaving Frontline. I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone if they want, but we're going to try to do it quietly to step out, because I was talking about this with Kal on the phone. He understands that well, I understand it well. But when you come at it from two different perspectives, you can really fall on either sides of the argument, and I think you can do that in good conscience. I think we kind of both agree with that. So I kind of come from a more reformed position on this issue than Kal does, and we're both fine with that. That takes assumptions, but that's where we landed. So just for everyone online too, class is going to change. I would imagine Kal's just going to take it and continue on. So
next week and next semester I'll be finishing up the class. So.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So it's been great. Had a lot of fun time doing it.
Yeah, it's been a ton of fun having you.
Yeah. Good. I hope the best for Frontline and everything. So yeah. Thank you guys.
Is this your last Sunday or?
It is. Yeah. So I'll be around. I'll be around for another month doing the treasurer, and then I'll probably a little bit after that just helping out with getting that transition done, because that's a big project,
Yeah.
But yeah, from actual attending standpoint, yeah.